Awaaz.com.
This is the morning brief from the Economic Times, produced in collaboration with Awaaz.com.
The last week or so has been tough for India. While the coronavirus killed thousands, it was not the only challenge that Indians faced. A shortage of medicines, hospital beds, and oxygen cylinders in many locations left Indians gasping for breath, literally and metaphorically. People were desperate for help. They reached out to family, friends, and even strangers on social media. At a time like this, what did the organizations they worked for do for them? We reached out to people to find out their experiences.
Our offices did organize mental health programs and asked us to take time off to talk about any issues that we were having if we wanted to. And even during the second wave, it has helped out and is still there to provide us any sort of support if we need. And while that is acknowledged and well appreciated, there's just a small bit with respect to performance appraisals and the kind of expectations on performance that you have from your employee. As an employee, I felt that I was still expected to do a little more and over what was expected of me in order to get a good appraisal done for myself, which I felt was not something that I was mentally ready to do during the last year.
My current organization is also good in terms of healthcare and no pay cut policy, but there was one instant where they missed updating us that one of our colleagues got positive. This created a lot of tension among us.
Yeah, so I was tested positive on the 21st of this month, and then the news came to my TL actually, but then he was the first person to receive the information, and then the first thing that they did was to isolate me from the other people, and they just booked a cab from the office and they sent me home. What they could have done better was to isolate me. That was a perfect thing, but then they could have isolated my team as well, which is one thing that they didn't do. So that could have been done better.
The voices you heard did not want to be identified, but many would relate to these. In this episode, we will dig deeper on what organizations have been doing and can do to support their employees in these trying times. We will also hear some of the best practices that organizations can adopt and some tips for individuals to cope with COVID. From the Economic Times, I'm Rachita Prasad and you are listening to The Morning Brief. We have three guests today. Our first guest, Meeta Gangrade, Chief Digital and Operating Officer at One-to-One Health, which is among India's leading employee assistance program provider. Meeta and her team has helped over 500 companies support their respective employees during the pandemic. Our second guest is Meghna Mukherjee, who's a psychoanalytical psychotherapist and founder of the Engaging Circle. Meghna has been relentlessly working with people on mental health issues, especially those triggered or aggravated by the pandemic. And finally, we have Rica Bhattacharyya from the Economic Times. She writes on careers, workplaces, and has been closely tracking how organizations are managing their employees during the pandemic. Welcome to the podcast, Meeta, Meghna, and Rica.
Thank you, Rachita. Glad to be here.
Let's start with you, Meeta. You have been interacting with companies across the board. How are they engaging with employees right now to help them? How is it different in the second wave from what they have been doing since last year?
Right. So actually last year, I think, was a very different era now, it feels like, where I think most people were grappling with, I would say, change, fear, a new reality, the inception of social distancing and lockdown. This year, however, I think, especially in the last 2 weeks, everything has changed and we're now dealing with grief, loss, burnout, which is a completely new emotional landscape. And the steps that we now need to take or organizations have to deal with is almost like crisis response, right? And in order to do this, of course, there are a whole lot of things that organizations are trying to grapple with. The first one is, how do you give meaningful support and garner help to your employees? And in that, I've seen, a lot of different responses that are coming in, ranging from very superficial means where an organization says, can you just organize a webinar or a talk for my employees, versus organizations actually going that extra mile, setting up a task force, which is looking at availability of oxygen, looking at availability of beds, talking to employees, identifying their near and dear ones, and trying to garner the resources for them. Then there are organizations which are smaller, may not be able to do all of this, but they are creating kits for their employees, or they've done tie-ups with hospitals and other organizations to help them maneuver their employee base. There is a whole lot that companies are doing, especially around just simple things like giving leaves. But one thing I'm not looking at organizations doing too actively, which I think is very important, is creating a psychological safety net and support system, which is way beyond the oxygen, the cylinders, and the doctors, which is really, really talking to employees and trying to understand how they're emotionally and physically doing.
That's interesting perspective, Meeta. Rica, we keep hearing from companies about the COVID relief initiatives that they are announcing in their workplace. You are talking to a lot of companies, and the second wave has been really harsh. Can you share with us what is actually happening on the ground, and what are companies doing to help their employees right now? Do you have any examples of interesting initiatives companies may have taken?
The second wave, I would say, is the most distressing time from the people's perspective. And for companies, when I talk to them, what I understand is that helping people struggling with COVID-19 has taken absolute precedence over every other initiative. If I can give you a few examples from the companies that I have been in touch with, ITC, for example, they are providing medical infrastructure like COVID care facilities for mildly symptomatic patients, their employees. They're giving oxygen support. RPG, for example, they have tied up with many 3-star, 4-star, 5-star hotels to set up emergency bed facilities for employees. Then they're helping sourcing medical support through partnership with hospital chains, helping and arranging remdesivir, getting oxygen beds. Dalmia Bharat, for example, they have tied up with doctors for online consultation, providing oxygen support. Dalmia Cement also is, giving unlimited medical reimbursement for COVID-affected employees. So, they're saying that even if it runs into lakhs, we are going to take care of it. Then we know that factories are, though corporate offices are shut mostly in most large companies across the country, but factories are still functioning. So there again, companies have a different set of challenges because workers are coming in. So, companies like Tata Steel, Vedanta, they are doing regular rapid antigen testing for all employees on the shop floor. They have staggered shift timings. They have, doctors helpline. They have, all kinds of medical assistance available on the shop floor.
That's interesting perspective, Rica. But we also are aware of people who are really in a desperate situation and probably are not getting the kind of help and support that you are referring to from their organization. Meghna, you have been dealing with a lot of people through the entire last year. I mean, the pandemic has taken a toll on their mental well-being, but the situation right now is getting worse in the second wave. And now it's a matter of survival, as our other guests are also highlighting. From your interactions with the patients, what are the biggest issues they are facing right now? I mean, when I spoke to you earlier, you told me that a lot of them are actually suffering from COVID. So what actually is, the top concern for them right now?
The top concern for them happens to be survival, like you pointed out, because they're finding everything to be extremely relevant. So their work seems like of very little significance to them at this point, because there's a lot of helplessness and there's a lot of anger that most of my patients talk about, and their coping abilities have been challenged greatly because they don't know what to do with this magnitude of loss and grief and death and destruction. There's a constant sense of uncertainty, and most of the people who are coming to us right now are actually being diagnosed with different kinds of anxiety disorders, something that they have never experienced before. So for them, the most important concern is, how do we survive? What do we do? How are we supposed to cope? what are we supposed to do? So everybody has somebody in the house who probably has COVID, or is they're looking out for oxygen, for hospitals, for beds. So their own work, the work that they have to do every day, meetings and calls and connecting with their team members, talking to their clients, it just seems so irrelevant for them at this point that no matter what support is being given, I mean, most of the companies do have a task force and all the systems are in place, but the ground reality is that like very few people are actually able to really benefit from that.
That actually kind of captures the mood in general. But when we are talking about the support that one can get from organizations, I mean, it's unfair to expect them to go out and do things, because they also have restrictions and constraints that they are operating within. Rika, in your interactions, what are the challenges companies are facing in helping out people? Have they shared anything on in terms of things where they are struggling to kind of help people due to some restriction or the other?
Yeah, absolutely, Rachita. I mean, companies are trying to do a lot of things, and these are mostly, large established companies that we are talking about. But even they are facing challenges because of the sheer stress on the healthcare system. I mean, people everywhere in the country is struggling. We know there are no beds, there is no oxygen, there is a shortage of medicines. But companies are trying to help to the extent best possible they can. But having that said, that there are also several smaller companies, mid-sized companies that themselves do not have the capacity to help their employees to that extent. And we see a lot of colleagues chipping in, a lot of WhatsApp groups being formed, and people are trying to help each other from wherever they can.
Clearly, I mean, your ability to work would obviously depend on your bandwidth, and like you said that companies are doing whatever they can. But Meeta, just coming to you now, you deal with companies of all shapes and sizes. If I were to ask you, what are some of the things that employers, I mean, who do not have a lot of resources, these companies, what can they do to help people in physical and mental well-being right now?
Right. So I think the first thing first is I've just crystallized anything that any company can do into 4 buckets, right? The first part is empathy. Do you even have it? Do you even feel for your employees? And when I say empathy, do you understand what your employee is going through right now? Like I said, that change in mind shift of expectations from your employees to show up to work when a near and dear one is suffering is a big change. It's not easy for companies to just switch that mindset and develop empathy. But having empathy is one part of it, and who has empathy in the organization. And I think the next big thing is, how do you communicate and reach out to your employees and let them know that you are there for them, you're going to support them through whatever be the unknowns. And like, for example, I went through COVID myself, and the first thing I did on the day that I got COVID was actually prepared a video and just talked about it to my teams. And it made them feel like even a leader can be vulnerable, even an HR person can be vulnerable at this point of time. Just knowing there's camaraderie within everybody in the organization, they understand what you're going through, is step one, and communicating that is very, very important. And these things don't need money and anything else other than intent, right? Then there is action. So what can you actually convert into action after you have empathy and reach? I think the actionables, like everybody's been talking about, is, can you give them leave? Can the companies take extreme steps like giving people time off? The third thing is, how do you drive safety? How do your employees feel safe within the organization? If you log on to a call and you're starting to talk about deadlines, or you're talking about everything that's not working, no employee is wanting to feel like they're going to work for you. So how are you communicating the fact that it's okay? Cut people some slack, right? Can you create an hour, simple hour in your day, where people log on to a call and just talk about nothing, no work, nothing. You're just talking to each other to check in on each other. Can you invite psychologists through your EAP providers or counselors to moderate some of these sessions and deal with the helplessness and grief? Of course, if you're a smaller company with lesser resources, you could set up a small task force that is only taking care of people, and it's also being done in rotation. So there are a number of steps, but one thing I would think companies will need to do in the coming week is identify your vulnerable folks. There are a certain segment of people who are very, very heavily impacted with this. and they need to be given a different kind of nurture and care.
That's a very relevant perspective you've shared, Meeta. Meghna, I wanted to bring you in at this stage. Meeta has given us a very deep insight into what organizations can do. Do you have anything to add in terms of what organizations can do or what co-workers can do to kind of help the others?
Well, I think Meeta has pretty much very beautifully covered, the philosophy that most companies, organizations can have in mind. But the challenge is to actually implement it. So there are these small, conversations and points that I keep hearing from my patients that they still are very, very overloaded with work. And this is something we're hearing across, like when me and my colleagues talk about cases, we're hearing that in the past 2 weeks, there's been so much of chaos all around us. And yet, there is, the workload hasn't really gone down. So, there are just very small things I think organizations can do. For example, reimagine what target really means at this point, because everybody is in a very vulnerable position. There are people who already had existing mental health challenges. They are extremely triggered right now. People who never experienced any mental health challenge are also experiencing something like anxiety. And so the companies have to really sit together and figure out what does target really mean, because none of the actual targets would be met. Because again, like I said, survival is the main question. One of the things that they get very stressed about is that, work calls can no longer be at oddly hours. Many a times, for example, they won't be able to take a call in the evening. But then often what happens is that one person or the people who can't take a call in the evening or very early in the morning are often termed as being non-collaborative. And that really hits them because they're not able to express to the teammates, to their bosses, that we're dealing with a lot more now. Many people have people at home who have COVID. So therefore, there's a lot of isolation. There's a lot of medical assistance that the only person who's not affected is giving. So it's becoming very, very difficult, like I said before, for people to actually focus on work, because work does seem a bit irrelevant. At the same time, there is a financial insecurity. So they can't afford to quit or leave or take a break. And one more thing that I was sort of hearing, and of course, this is of course people's experiential accounts, but ideally they should be like a leave, or they should have some sort of a compensatory leave. But the minute there's work from home, there is no demarcation. So there is no fixed working hour. And even if they're supposed to have leave, like for example, a lot of my patients who are actually working in media and this entire like journalists, the minute they are actually working from home, their organizations feel that they don't need 2 leaves. They can do with one because they're working from home. And that's so distressing.
That's a very relevant point, Meghna, because all of us are feeling that the lines between work hours and home hours are really blurred now. There is no starting point and ending point. You highlighted a very relevant point about the financial insecurity. Can I just ask you, Rica, are you seeing a different stance among companies now? Because last year, a lot of companies cut salaries, even jobs. Is there any relief on that front for employees right now?
There are some companies which are actually telling their employees that, we are not cutting your jobs, we are not cutting your salary. So just take care of your health. I mean, of course, there are others that are doing very differently. Marico, for instance, they gave increments just last week for FY21, and they had given last year as well. There is also a clear communication to employees that, there will be no pay cut, there will be no job cut. RPG, another company, which has given increment to everyone, and they have said that they're going to even give increment for this year. They follow a July cycle. So there are examples of companies who are trying to help out and giving people the assurance that, financially you are secure, your jobs are secure. So just focus on your health, take care of your health. But having said that, like all my other co-speakers also mentioned, that there is tremendous pressure on people. At the same time, there are a lot of challenges for companies as well. So everybody is, trying to figure out, what is the way ahead, basically.
Absolutely. Everybody is trying to figure out the way ahead. And in figuring out, people will make mistakes. Meeta, if I were to ask you, what have been some of the biggest mistakes employers have committed in this phase? I mean, will this experience have an impact on how employees view their companies in the long term? What is your take on it?
Absolutely, Rachita. I mean, right now, I think everybody is going through clockwork motion, right? But when there will be time to pause and reflect, you are going to remember all those moments that your employer made you feel terrible, not heard, and not listened to. But I think the first and foremost thing to remember is companies who are responding better right now are the ones who had planned for an eventuality like this. And by plan, I mean you've got mechanisms in place already to kind of react and respond to this in different ways. But the most important thing at the heart of it is, I would say, that human resources used to be having this word called human at the heart of it. If you've lost the bus on being human, being able to be empathetic as a leader, as an organizational, culture, then I think nobody is going to really want to work for you after this pandemic. Now, examples of human, right? First and foremost, like Meghna was talking about, that people still have deadlines, workload is not reducing. Have you been a leader who's been able to go and talk to your clients, talk to your sales teams and say guys, slow down, it's okay, can you recalibrate targets? Or are you just saying these statements that we're here for you, but you're really doing nothing beyond making that statement? Secondly, you have to remember that you cannot establish a relationship of communication with your team overnight. If you've not done it through the last year, the odds are nobody's going to care about what you have to say to them. They're perhaps working for you only because you're paying them that paycheck, and they're perhaps not going to come motivated to your organization either. So, leaders who've been absent in the last 1 year, who've not taken the time out to check on people, who've only got on a call and discussed transactions, are not going to be the most favorite people that people would want to work for. One last point is, what is the marketing that you've been doing in the last 1 year? Are you talking about all the challenges and the things that didn't go well? Or are you actually taking the time out to identify the little things that your teams have delivered may not have been optimally, despite what is happening? People have come into work, delivered, people have shouldered responsibility, and have you been able to recognize them, compensate them? Are employees at the heart of all your decisions? Or do you treat employees as a commodity that you can replace, fire, hire, when you please?
Uh, Rachita, if I can just add one point to what Meeta just
Yes,
mentioned,
Rika, please do.
what she was talking about communication from the leadership, I think that never ever has the role of leadership in communicating to their employees been so important as it is now, because we are in unprecedented time. Everyone is under tremendous stress, tremendous pressure. And, if you take care of your employees in tough times, people will stay with you forever.
That's a very, very relevant point. Before we wrap up, I have been looking at what people are going through, and I know the anxiety levels are really high. The Yale University has a course called The Science of Wellbeing. This course was very popular since last year because of how effective it was in helping people. One of the first things that Professor Laurie Santos says in it is that the belief that knowing is half the battle won is a fallacy. Until you know how to use it, any learning is futile. And that, I think, is what I'm personally experiencing, and I see a lot of us experiencing right now. We know that we need to keep calm. We know we need to cut off and focus on our mental wellness, but it's really tough. Meghna, in a situation like this, people say stay calm, but it's really tough. How does one do that? I mean, before we wrap up, can you share some tips of dealing with anxiety right now? We are all dealing with a lot of fear. What can we do to kind of stay calm, or just to be in a position that we can help ourselves and others better?
Absolutely. I think, actually, the most positive aspect of this entire pandemic has been that I've seen people become very pro mental health. Somehow they've used this entire pandemic sort of, be aware of whatever struggles they were already ongoing. So, a lot many more people are actually sort of open to coming to a mental health professional and to talk about what they're going through. So I've actually seen, on the contrary, that the stigma actually has gone down a bit because they're able to use pandemic as a context to finally be in touch with what they've always been going through, and which has obviously been triggered 10x in this pandemic. So one of the most important things I will actually suggest is that people are sort of when they are very stressed, or when they are trying to deal with the grief of this magnitude, uncertainty of this magnitude, people just sort of mindlessly consume TV shows, Netflix, Amazon Prime, and that is sort of making them very numb, because people want to experience that numbness because there's so much chaos around them. But I will suggest the contrary. I'll suggest that rather than just mindlessly consuming all of these TV shows or internet or scrolling down any of the social media sites, actually sit down with your feelings. It's very important for people to find expressions either through words or through some creative project, whether it's art, whether it's poetry. Now, I know it all sounds very, very theoretical, but actually, a lot of people have found a lot of relief when they've been able to sit with their feelings rather than numb it. Apart from that, like, everybody is talking about it, reducing screen time, especially for COVID related information. It's enough for all of us to just, log in, maybe take half an hour, 1 hour in a day, collect whatever info we have to collect, and then cut off from that. Rather, because there's so much uncertainty around us, we probably can try to focus on making our day as certain as possible by having some sort of a rudimentary routine, which absolutely must include some kind of exercise, some kind of a creative project, and most importantly, what I'm basically sort of helping my patients work through is to learning to say no to work after a certain point of time, because those boundaries don't exist. We don't have a separate workspace and a separate home space. It's extremely important for people to be unapologetic and to be able to say a no to work or working after their working hours, which of course is becoming very difficult because of the insecurities people are having at this point. But at the same time, I think this is one of the most important assertive skills that people need to imbibe at this point. So these are some basic, suggestions I can give that might help a lot of people at least process what they're going through.
Meghna, those are some very lovely and practical tips. I definitely saw at least 2-3 things that I can incorporate in my life starting now. So thanks a lot for that. And anybody listening to this podcast, help is around. There are people like Meghna who are only a phone call away. So don't be afraid of asking for help. Thank you so much, Meeta, Meghna, and Rica, for being on this podcast. This has been a very interesting conversation, and I'm sure people listening to it will take away something useful for them, their organization, and hopefully things will get better. Thank you so much for being with us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks, Rachita.
Thanks, Rachita.
While many companies have extended exemplary support towards employees, many others seem to be still lacking. An organization can be a big support system for an individual, and it's time that statements like "we are one family" become more than lip service. There is a lot that organizations can do to help people in their physical and mental well-being, and as our guests highlighted, not all initiatives require deep pockets. We hope you've been able to get some ideas that can be incorporated in your organizations or in your personal life to tide over this pandemic. Individuals should not be afraid of seeking help or hesitate to prioritize their health over deadlines, projects, and deliverables. As the cliche goes, "Jaan hai to jahan hai." While there is life, there is hope. That's all from us for now. I'm Rachita Prasad, and you've been listening to The Morning Brief. This episode was edited by Bhavya Dilip Kumar, while Nehal Chalyawala coordinated it. I hope you found this episode informative and useful. We look forward to your feedback. Write to us at themorningbrief@timesgroup.com. And if you like this episode, please do share it on social media. The Morning Brief airs every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. Thank you for listening. Stay safe and take care of yourself.
Avaz.com